Welcome to episode 12 of The Red Matrix. Sean, it's very difficult to keep pace with developments.
It's been a very busy week, hasn't it? We're going to cover today, Russia has lost two strategically vital aircraft that should have been safe, well away from the front line. Ukraine will have been delighted. We're also going to look at the Red Sea attacks after the West, US and the UK attacked a massive Houthi targets, and that hasn't defeated Houthis. They've actually come back. And they've ended up actually striking for the first time a merchant shipping vessel. And then finally, we're going to have a look at what it feels like to be a pilot. As a former fast jet pilot, what does it feel like for those Typhoon pilots heading out on their mission to strike those Houthi targets? Lot to cover this week.
So Russia lost two of its surveillance aircraft in this past week over Russian airspace. These are really important strategic planes that they have. They normally fly well out of harm's way. How could this possibly happen, Sean?
That's, for me, the nub of it. Normally you have things like the A-50, which was apparently shot down as a surveillance aircraft. It's got radars that look out over 200 miles or so. The advantage of having an airborne radar rather than on the ground is on the ground, obviously you've got the curvature of the Earth, so it can't see that far. As soon as you put a radar in an aircraft, it can look significantly further. But these assets are generally very high value. You want to keep them as far back from the front line as you possibly can. And and an IL-22, which is a command and control aircraft. The fact that Russia lost both of these on Sunday over the Sea of Azov is a bit strange. Now, Russia doesn't dispute that they were targeted. It looks like the IL-22 managed to land. There are some pictures doing the rounds that show a lot of damage to the aircraft. It's pretty impressive it landed, but that's probably been written off. But at least the bodies on board were saved. But the A-50, the big aircraft that was lost. So the question is, how on earth did it get shot down? Now, we'll probably never know. Let's be clear. I don't have the sort of insight that can provide that. But they will never have operated that aircraft anywhere near the Ukrainian air defense systems that have the range to get out to them. The way this works is that you know what the surface-to-air missiles look like, you know their radars, you know their radar signatures, and you have defensive aids and all sorts of other aircraft out there that track when these radars pop on, and you know what the range is. So you might see a radar light you up, but you know that's associated with a missile that's got a range of 20 miles. So as long as you're more than 30 miles away, you know it doesn't matter. And by operating comfortably in Russian airspace, these aircraft will have been somewhere away. Now, there's lots of conjecture, which I have to say I sort of subscribe to, which is that the Patriot missile system supplied by the US is an incredibly capable long-range missile.
How far does it go?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Americans never released the ranges, but it does look it's up to 100 miles, I think. It's that sort of range. But the truth of the matter is we'll probably never know. But again, in principle, the Russians should know where those aircraft, where the radars are, where the missile systems are. I think, though, if you're being really clever these days with how you position your kit and equipment, you can actually have the radar positioned separately from the missile systems. So you could put the radar in a position, because they're normally co-located, but you might have an extra radar somewhere that illuminates the target, and therefore the target thinks I'm far enough away from that radar that the missile can't hit me. But actually the missile's been launched from another location. And it takes a bit of coordination. Not all the missile systems are able to do that, but certainly in the air war, they use that system where one aircraft paints the target with a radar, but another aircraft will take the data of where that target is and target it. Now, it tends to be a bit of a one-off attack, but it's very hard to imagine otherwise. How on earth these two aircraft be shot down?
Okay, so the original radar that identifies it looks innocent to the target, paints it, as you say, delivers some sort of signature or coordinates to the missile base. Missile is fired. What else has the missile got now in its memory so it can identify this target as the target moves through the air?
Yeah, without getting specifically into Patriot, because first of all, I'm no expert at Patriot, but there are a lot of missile systems that basically guide towards the target area. And once they're close to the target, they start using a different form of radar signature to hone to the actual target, because your target is moving around at 300 or 400 miles an hour. So you can initially, if you're launching 100 miles away, you launch into the general area. But then you have to have a target tracking radar to actually get the final bit of the tracking. Now, again, back in the Cold War, or when I was fighting, it was one missile, you paint the target, you launch it, fire and forget. And that's generally how missile systems work. But I'm trying to work out at the moment how on earth the Russians, they've been doing this a long time, they wouldn't deliberately put these strategically important assets so close to an enemy system. Why would you do that? So it seems to be there's been an element of surprise used and an innovation, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Ukrainians are cock a hoop. But the A-50 certainly, I think there's a crew of 15
Yeah, so
in
it's
that.
not just one pilot.
No, it's a lot of people in there. And
Yeah.
it depends how you do the accounting, because some aircraft might look serviceable but not. But it sounds like the Russians only had 10 of these aircraft anyway. So to lose one is quite a significant loss.
Yeah, and the curvature of the Earth means that if you're actually on the ground, you've got very limited line of sight. If you're up at 40, 50,000 feet, which these planes actually fly very high, you get more visibility. So we only see it in films, but the moment that missile is launched or shortly afterwards, everybody on the plane knows something's after them. That's pretty scary.
Well, that's why you have these defensive aid suites and on your aircraft, which are a whole suite of responses. Some of them are chaff, some of them are, the little bits of foil. Some of them are flares, which actually can distract infrared missiles. But there's also some electronic means that you can do to defeat missiles, to spoof a missile, so that, so for example, if a radar blip comes towards you, it bounces off your aircraft and goes back to the missile. But there's some clever software now that can take that ding as it comes towards your aircraft, hold it, and release it a little bit later. Now that therefore gives the impression to the radar that you're a bit further away than you actually are.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
therefore you can, there's various tricks you can play electronically to try to spoof where the radar thinks you are compared to where you actually are. So there's a whole
cat and mouse.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that's what the Cold War was always about countermeasures, countermeasures. But coming back to this, it's a very strategically important success
Big
for Ukraine. But
And it'll make Russia more cautious. You have to think about this sort of thing. In terms of intelligence and data, it's a big factor of modern war.
And they'll have to
start
move
lose
further
that.
back. They'll definitely try to learn some lessons and move
Yeah,
further back. It'll be
yeah.
a salutary lesson for the
Yeah.
Russian Air Force.
So the big question, Sean, even if you knew the answer, you wouldn't be able to tell us. The big question is, who pressed the button? Who fired the missile?
Also, I think that the subtext of that is that how much... It's one thing pressing the button, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's Ukraine pressed the button. The intelligence that's required to create where is the target, where is it going to be, how are the tactics used to try to shoot something like down, what other intelligence are you using? A good example of this is, you remember the what was it called, the Russian flagship, the Moskva, that was shot down. Moskva, which was shot down by Neptune missiles by the Ukrainians right near the start of the war. And when gradually the story came out about that, was that how on earth did the Ukrainians, without a navy, hit the Moskva? And it turned out the Moskva was literally driving in a racetrack pattern, predictably racetrack pattern, in the middle of the Black Sea. Now, how did the Ukrainians know that? Well, lots of other assets would have been looking into that area and would have been able to track the ship doing a predictable pattern. Now, the Russian ship would have known if the Neptune missiles were on their way, because the Neptune missiles have a radar system. But if you don't turn the radar system on of the Neptune until the last few seconds, you give the Russian ship very little time to react. So how do you target the Neptune missiles if you don't turn on their radar? Well, if you know how long it takes for a Neptune missile to get from your launch site to the ship, and you know that the Russian ship is driving a predictable pattern, it's a simple maths exercise to work out from where you launch where the ship is actually going to be on its racetrack. And if you know that, then you can simply tell the missile to turn the radar on 5 seconds before it hits. It's looking for the target about there. When it turns the radar on, there's a target about there, and it schwacks it. So is it the person who pressed the button, or is it this complex amalgam of intelligence that creates the opportunity for you to use a missile in an unconventional way to have the impact you want on the ground?
Yeah, big story, big mystery. Sean, the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has just announced that he's devoting a further 2.5 billion to the war in Ukraine as a promise to Zelensky. Seems a lot of money. What sits behind it, and is it a lot of money, or as much as it sounds?
There's no doubt that President Zelensky, because Rishi Sunak actually travelled to Ukraine to make the announcement, and President Zelensky undoubtedly will have been delighted. It's a chunky amount of money. Money itself won't help Ukraine directly win the war. What it needs is weapons. Now, it needs money because it needs to fund its own production facilities for weapons, so that'll help. The Prime Minister wasn't specific about what military aid would be given. I suspect part of that will be depending on what actually, now that they've got a financial envelope, what is it that President Zelensky needs? What's top of his wish list? It might be air defense missiles, which are about protection. It might be about tanks and artillery, about attack. So I suspect we're not going to hear a lot of detail about that in the near term. I think what's fascinating from my perspective, though, is that it sounds a chunky amount of money, but if you look at the EU has had its funding for President Zelensky blocked by Hungary, and we haven't heard anything moving yet. I understand February might be the time that gets looked at again. And the US was looking at over 60 billion that was being blocked by Congress. And of course, we're seeing in the news more talk about presidential elections, and of course the distraction of Israel and the Red Sea is that when will that come unblocked? If you add those together, you're talking about 100 billion in round numbers of aid. So our 2.5 billion, whilst it's a chunky sum, is only 2%, just over 2% of the total that Ukraine probably needs. And therefore, it's important. I wouldn't want to underplay that. But if President Zelensky is going to prevail in this coming year, if there's going to be meaningful support from the West, it's the chunky numbers that are going to have to be released. And of course, we're a relatively small country. It's only when we put 2% of our GDP into defence, and therefore therefore we support NATO. It's really difficult for us to do any more.
But even if it's only a small amount in terms of the few weeks or whatever the period is it gives him, given that there's a bit of a stall in the US money and the EU money, we are a bit of an outlier. So Zelensky's probably got a lot to be thankful for.
He has, and there's no doubt he'll be delighted with this. But I think what's most important is it's the international community. Bluntly, Ukraine is too small to prevail on its own. It's been courageous. It's been amazingly effective at stopping the Russians. But without having the tools to do the job, it'll be very difficult for Ukraine to prevail. And of course, part of this is, Grant Shapps, he announced only yesterday, he was at a major defence speech saying it was a dangerous world, and that all nations need to be looking at spending more on defence. I think what's fascinating about that, though, was he said there's only 7 countries in NATO that are actually spending their 2%. Really, we shouldn't be subsidising the rest of NATO. He didn't say that, but that was the subtext, which incidentally was what President Trump was saying, if you remember, some years ago, in slightly more colourful language. But he was saying the same, that everybody should be paying in to this insurance policy, which is effectively NATO. But of course, Grant Shapps said that, and as the Rishi Sunak had said, the ambition of the Conservatives was to get to 2.5% funding, but couldn't really say when that was going to be. I think what for me was quite amusing in a way, Grant Shapps kept resonating to Margaret Thatcher when she was standing resolve, difficult world, Cold War. And one of the journalists asked a question that said, you do realise that when Margaret Thatcher was in the chair, we spent 4%, over 4% of our GDP on defence. Is this the time to be spending that sort of money again? And immediately you heard a slightly different story coming out of the Grant Shapps of more. Well, it's not so much the amount of money; it's how we spend it. And of course, that's true. But I do think that most of our viewers will look at this as quite a dangerous world out there. And what's our part in it? Are we just an island nation, keep our head down, or do we have a role to play? And bluntly, unless we spend the money, it's very difficult to see how we can have a significant role to play.
I guess, Cold War finishes, people begin to forget wars. They believe we're entering a sort of peaceful period in the world. That means you don't have to spend as much on defence. The percentage you said, comes down half what it was back in Margaret Thatcher's days. And then suddenly we're hit with conflict all over the place, and ones that we're actually getting involved in. And the chatter around is actually maybe we need to sort of beef up our defences all of a sudden.
It's a difficult conversation. I think Grant Shapps was definitely followed exactly that theme. He said there was a sort of Cold War dividend when that ended, peace in our time, and we can take a dividend because we're not having to spend so much money on defence. But our potential enemies didn't stop spending. And that, in a way, history will judge, was that a wise thing to back off on spending because you allow others to catch up, whether it's in technology or quantity. And that's what's happened. And who would have thought we'd seen a war on our European continent in your and my time? And here we are. And we've got dragged into the conflict in the Red Sea. And, the war in Israel doesn't look like any time soon. So, there are troubling times out there. And we mustn't take defence of our nation for granted.
Yeah, this is a really important topic, isn't it, Sean? Because, going back to the end of the Cold War, the dividend, are we entering peacetime? Actually, what has started to happen is other actors have emerged in the world. And, for instance, the Houthi group. And, when they got to a position where they could challenge or be in a position of leadership in the Yemen, they then started to raise taxes. And what proportion we don't know, but a lot of that money was spent building up their defence capability. And now they've moved from being a sort of irritant to being actually quite a powerful force that's doing damage in the area of Yemen and the Red Sea.
Yeah, I think there's always a bit below the layers of these things. I mean, none of what you've said is not true, but it's also worth pointing out that they are a bit of a proxy for Iran as well. And the Houthis attacking shipping in the Red Sea, although the British government is trying to make clear that they're only attacking the Houthis because of the free trade, 15% of the global trade goes through the Red Sea. As now it's been disrupted, it's putting up the prices of everything. You can't. The West had put a military umbrella over shipping using military ships, but ultimately you've got to stop the fighting. And they've said that's because of the Houthis. The Houthis actually have no reason to attack shipping if it wasn't for the fact that, as they have said, we're going with our brothers, Hamas brothers. We are fighting for them to stop. To get America to put pressure on Israel to stop the war. And of course, we must never forget that Iran funds Hamas, it funds Hezbollah, and it funds the Houthis, not just funding, but military equipment and military training as well. And therefore, the Houthis have enough on their plate in Sana'a and the north of Yemen and peace talks with Saudi Arabia. And that they're on a road to legitimacy. The weapons they've got, they're not a first world nation in terms of military capability. These missiles they've got they've only got them because Iran has been happy to provide them. They haven't used them particularly effectively yet, although we'll come on to how they have hit at least one ship so far. But it does mean that the more you've got these organizations growing and getting a more substantial base somewhere, and they've got the backing of a major power that wants mischief in the world, like Iran, that's when it becomes very dangerous.
Yeah, the Houthis, as you say, a small group, being a proxy for Iran's pretty dangerous. A small group that started off as a very peaceful religious sort of group, now, having some, international status politically as well in the Yemen. Last week we looked at the attacks they made against our ships and the response that we delivered, which was pretty fatal, at least for the 4 boats, and they managed to protect our vessels. The very next day, the Houthis came back with their own response, didn't they, Sean?
Well, yeah. I mean, what's been fascinating is that, as you say, the Houthis have been creating all sorts of threat. We recorded on the Wednesday last week. On the Thursday, the US and the UK mounted a huge series of attacks against specific targets, 60 targets, 150 munitions overnight. Seemed to be targeting Houthi radar sites, missile launch sites where the boats were being delivered, and pretty surgical series of strikes. Most of the strikes were Tomahawk missiles, which is what you'd expect because they fire and forget, find their targets and schwack them. Whereas the British involvement was 4 Typhoons, which means that the aircraft had to go into enemy territory and put their pink bodies on the line to be able to deliver the ordnance. But it does appear that was a successful series of strikes. But the very next day, the Houthis launched another anti-ship cruise missile. So that led to the Americans doing a one-off, looks like a mopping up operation, with either taking out the radar that they'd missed, or it might have been the battle damage assessment of the previous nice actions that maybe not all of the targets had actually been hit, so they went back to mop it up. But it's really interesting then, the follow-up. Only yesterday, Rishi Sunak's in the House of Parliament sort of speaking to the House, and there's lots of then concerns about what we knew, how much we should be engaged, and the very fact that at the start of the war between Israel and Hamas, we were sympathetic politically with Israel, but I doubt we really wanted to get involved militarily. And since then, we've been providing long-range drones surveillance over Gaza. The last few weeks, HMS Diamond's been firing Sea Viper missiles, which it hasn't fired for the best part of 4 decades before. And now we've got British Typhoons bombing targets, military targets in the Yemen. That seems to me an escalation.
We are being dragged into it.
We are, and that's the concern, is that what next? And also concerns about what is the British government actually seeking to achieve. There were lots of discussion. Are we looking to defeat the Houthis? No, this isn't about defeating the Houthis. This is about saying, if you keep disrupting international shipping, which is having huge implications for global prices, you and I might not care about the price of bread going up a few pennies, but there are millions, in fact billions of people who it does matter. And free trade is really important. And therefore, Houthis, you can't be attacking here. But so this was a rap across the knuckles, take out some of their capability. But of course, they immediately came back. And we've seen another, only yesterday, another missile launched at a US-based or US-owned bulk cargo carrier, which apparently hits the vessel, caused a fire, didn't stop it being seaworthy, apparently no casualties. So what does the British government do next?
Yeah, it must be pretty scary out there. It's okay talking about it sitting in our armchairs here. It must be pretty scary. A lot of stuff's been flying around. So far, we've managed to protect our vessels. The US done the same. Commercial shipping as well, being protected. And yet, a couple of days ago, a Houthi missile actually struck a ship and did some damage. That's pretty scary.
It's incredibly scary. It does sound as if there are no casualties, but it just demonstrates that it's all very well trying to provide a protective umbrella, but eventually missiles will get through. What looks likely is that the attack, rather than being in the Bab al-Mandab Straits, where there's a good umbrella, this latest attack happened 100 miles off the southeast of Yemen. Probably that wasn't the same level of coverage, and therefore the target was probably more exposed. But even so, it's a very worrying development.
Can you imagine the effect on commercial shipping, the companies, the insurance companies now, after that one single hit, there'll be a riot of consideration about everything. Do we do it? What's the costs? What are the risks? What do the employees feel? Wow.
Well, it's also up till now, it's been focused because the Bab al-Mandeb Straits is right next to Yemen. It's the choke point. It's only 20 miles open, and therefore you can see the ships go past. They feel vulnerable. As soon as you're in the open oceans, you don't feel vulnerable. But these anti-ship ballistic missiles can travel hundreds, if not thousands of miles. So all of a sudden now, it's not just about those straits. It could be anywhere in the region. And global shipping, there's a lot of trade. 90% of global trade goes by sea. So at some stage, this has to stop. And regardless of the link to the Israel-Hamas war, the West cannot allow global shipping to come under threat.
So, Sean, you mentioned the Typhoons. The British Typhoons were used, the fighter jets. Up until then, we'd relied, we and the US and others had relied on, missiles, remote attack through missiles, so no humans involved, pretty safe. The Typhoon's a fighter jet. It requires a pilot, so we're putting a pilot in harm's way. It's quite a big shift, isn't it?
Yeah, it was interesting, wasn't it? The US had predominantly used Tomahawk cruise missiles for the attacks against the Houthi military targets. So I was intrigued to know why the UK involvement wasn't something similar. Right? Why would it put Typhoons in, which generally have to fly into enemy territory and fly over or very close to the target, which obviously puts them in harm's way. So why would you do that? Part of the reason lies in the fact that the US and the UK, under political direction, were really clear that they want to minimise the number of casualties. So they would have looked at a series of targets over many days to work out where the radars are, where the missile sites are, where the command and control nodes are. But they'd also done pattern of life, how many people come and go, because they clearly would want to minimise the number of people who were killed during the attack. Now, that's one of the reasons they attacked at night, because people are generally at home in their beds. The problem with the cruise missiles is once you launch them, they're largely fire and forget, so they can take some time to reach their target. If they're launched from 200 or 300 miles away, they're going to take at least 30 minutes to get to their target. And of course, the ground situation can change during that time. Now, if you are attacking targets where there is the greater potential for people to be coming or going, then you want a shorter time of flight for the weapon. So by putting an aircraft over the target with its sensor looking down at the target area, it gives you real-time information about whether there's anybody on the ground that happens to have turned up, or there are people nearby, that you can delay the launch of your bomb until such time as you're comfortable that the threat is gone. And that's one of the reasons they use the Paveway 4 guided munition, because that will have had the ability for the targeting pod on the Typhoon to lock on to its intended target. Once it's guaranteed that's the target, it'll often fire a laser then with a distinctive code on it, because each of the bombs will have had a different code in the nose of the guidance system, and that means that you can actually hit 3 or 4 targets at the same time, launch these bombs off, the laser is pointing with different codes at different targets, and then in they go. And even last minute, even with a few seconds time of flight, if somebody comes out of that building, or several people do, you can walk the laser spot off the target into a clear area and therefore protect that target. So it's a much more responsive way of targeting. So that seems to be the reason why they've done that. But it was a fantastic show of professionalism because the headlines are all about one aircraft delivering a bomb. Those aircraft are based in Cyprus. There's hundreds of people there with support people. When they knew about the tasking, when the British Typhoons knew about it, the squadron there would have been firing on all cylinders. There'd be weapons instructors trying to match the weapons to the targets. There would have been armourers building the weapons, getting them onto the aircraft. There'll be guys servicing the aircraft, getting the spares, getting the software loaded up with the threat scenarios. A real team effort. And then, of course, for the planners, it's not as simple. This was a 3,500 mile round trip for those jets. They needed air-to-air refuelling. So you needed Voyager aircraft. Where are they going to be based? Where are they going to be? Where are you going to intercept them? the target's got to be hit at a certain time, coordinated with all the other strikes. So you've got to work backwards from that time. When do I need to fill up with fuel, on where? When do I need to take off? When do I need to brief, get loaded up with my kit and everything? It's an incredibly complex sequence. And for the pilots themselves, walking out, you've done so much training, but when you walk out to a jet, and trust me, having done it, you walk out and this jet is laden with bombs, and there's lots of red labels hanging off them with pins that as you pull them out, that now weapon is ready to go. When it gets into the air, it's more sluggish getting off the ground because it's a lot heavier, it's less aerodynamic. And all of a sudden, when you're making the switches live in the cockpit, there's a real surge of adrenaline and responsibility because there's death and destruction in those bombs. You need to make sure that they're very carefully targeted and professionally handled, and you're worried about getting shot down over the target area. So huge team effort, incredibly proud of the British military professionalism and courage and teamwork that was demonstrated on that night.
Last time we did a short piece on fighter pilots in World War II getting 7 days training, and fighter pilots now getting 7 years training. It was a sort of playful little piece. I got some feedback, and some people were saying, yeah, but the planes in those days were much simpler, so, what's the point? What's your response to that?
Well, I think you and I discussed it afterwards. We were putting it out there as a bit of a soundbite just to see if people are listening, to be honest. And yeah, we got quite a lot of feedback. And they're absolutely right. There is a lot more to this than meets the eye. But the point was that the amount of training given to pilots in the Second World War was significantly less than is available now. And there's a number of reasons for that, one of which was the complexity of the aircraft. I've been lucky enough to sit in a Spitfire. I haven't flown in one, but sit in one. It's pretty rudimentary. There's no aids to help you fly through cloud particularly. You haven't got a radar. Bomb aiming and weapon aiming is really rudimentary. You don't have any defensive aid suites. You haven't got the communication systems, the link systems that modern aircraft have. It's a much more complicated aircraft these days, and therefore it takes a lot more to train people. It's also, these aircraft were relatively slow compared to supersonic fast jets and the like. So inevitably, technology needs a lot more handling and your capacity needs more. But I think the main point was that in the Second World War, we could produce Spitfires a lot quicker than we could produce pilots. We had plenty of Spitfires. The challenge was, therefore, there was a rush to get people through flying training. A lot of people killed themselves during flying training because it was all managed at a bit of a rush. And bluntly, when they got onto the front line, they often had only 6 or 7 trips on a Spitfire before they were thrown into combat. In other words, as long as you can start up and land it, and I think, as you and I discussed, landing these things is a tail dragger is actually very difficult. It's difficult taking off because it's so powerful it tries to twist on the ground, and landing it tries to twist on the ground as well. So it's a devil to land, a devil to take off. And unfortunately, the tactics at the time meant that the new boys followed their wingman, followed their leader very close, and they had most of their capacity was just flying the aeroplane and watching the guy ahead of them. Very little of it was looking around. And of course, the Red Baron at the time, with the aces at the time, they made no secret of the fact that they used to just pick off the new guys because they knew they weren't looking out. So they were literally in a turkey shoot. They would just fly down and shoot them out of the sky. And that's why they shot down so many aircraft. And for the Royal Air Force, if you survive those first few trips, you're going to survive a lot longer because that's how you gained your experience. Well, these days, we can't afford to lose lots of aircraft like that. We were generating thousands of aircraft, whereas today, I think the Typhoon, we bought 232 of them, if I remember, but we're only going to actually have less than half that actually in our service fleet. The number of Joint Strike Fighters, I believe so far we bought is less than 100. We can't afford that. They cost millions, hundreds of millions, and therefore we can't afford to lose them. So the training is very different. The simulators are very different. And a good example as well of in the Battle of Britain was when we probably became our closest to losing in the air war because we got everything in the air on that fateful day. What we have to remember, though, is that the Germans were at the limit of their flying range, so only had a few minutes of fuel for combat over the shores of Britain. And if they got shot down, their pilots would be incarcerated for the rest of the war. Whereas for our brave pilots, if they were shot down, providing they survived, they'd land in a field somewhere in the countryside, they'd be dusted down, given a pint of beer, sent straight back to the airfield to jump into a new aircraft and get off and start fighting again. So that was how short we were of pilots. So yes, the truth behind it is very different aircraft, very different scenario. But because we were in such a rush to get them into the skies, we lost a lot of pilots. The attrition rate was huge, not only in training, but also in those early days. And that's what created these mythical aces.